What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. I wanted to speak a little about colonial history in Africa because we often know so little about the process of colonization and what actually happened. So today, I wanted to speak on how Nigeria came to be colonized. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, including special illustrated videos on African history, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. The link to Patreon and Afrographics are in the description box below. The palm oil trade, which slowly replaced the slave trade by the 1850s, flourished and attracted more British merchants, mostly from Liverpool and Manchester. Although official presence was questioned when, in 1865, a parliamentary committee of the House of Commons suggested the slow withdrawal from the region, the formation of the United Africa Company, or UAC, by Tubman Goldie, a former army officer, strengthened the informal empire of Great Britain in the region of the Niger Delta. In a series of events between 1882 and 1897, British forces of the UAC and the Lagos government marched against African forces in Yorubaland and the Niger Delta. In 1897, the Benin Punitive Expedition put down the last remaining major opposition force in the south. In northern Nigeria, the conquest was led by Frederick Lugard, who had been actively involved in local affairs, first as a commissioned leader of a treaty expedition in 1894, then later as the main organizer of the West African Frontier Force, Britain's regional colonial army. The hostilities against the states of the Sokoto Caliphate between 1900 and 1903 clearly demonstrated the European technical advantage in warfare. A common phrase of British confidence was, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun," and they have not. The first hostilities between Europeans and a state of the Sokoto Caliphate broke out when, following a series of diplomatic infiltration, the Nupe people were conquered by troops of the Royal Niger Company, or the RNC, the successor of the UAC. In 1898, a British resident was sent to Sokoto itself, indicating a possible move toward diplomacy. This changed, however, altogether when Lugard took command of the British forces and completed the brutal war in 3 years. The Battle of Burmi in 1903 is often seen as an unnecessarily brutal ending of the campaign, which resulted in the death of over 600 people, most of them being the Fulani elite. Although the UAC received the royal charter and became the RNC in 1886, its rule lasted only until 1900, when the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria was formed. With the colony of Lagos and the Northern Nigerian Protectorate, the three Nigerias, if you will, represented distinct administrations, problems, and approaches. The oldest British settlement of Lagos, with a population of more than 40,000 people, presented a highly sensitive African intellectual elite with critical voices toward the administration. Additional problems of urban sanitation only caused further concerns that were not solved, despite the presence of governors like William McGregor, who surprisingly actually tried to address African needs and solve urgent issues of disease control and public sanitation, for example. His efforts and initiatives were often turned down by the colonial office as exaggerated, useless, and expensive, essentially British racism at its finest. His only significant triumph was the building of the Lagos Canal and the draining of the marshes around the town, which made further urban development possible. The Southern Protectorate remained largely a trading enterprise. Many members of the company rule were accepted as administrators. Subjugation of resisting regions and peoples, especially the Tiv people, presented a major problem for the Southern Protectorate in southern Nigeria. The different attitudes and composition of the administrative service could be traced through, for example, the neglect of African health issues prior to the joining of Lagos and the Eastern Territories in 1906. One of the most prominent colonial figures after the 1906 union was Walter Egerton, who was the governor of the region up until 1912. His activities can be described as anti-native or anti-African policy, especially against the Lagos intellectual community, as he abandoned the early so-called diplomacy and communication efforts and took a more confrontational approach, leading, for example, to forced land expropriation in Lagos. Northern Nigeria resembled a more military occupation. Up to the joining of these Nigerian regions in 1914, the proportion of British officials remained the highest in comparison to traders or miners of the southern territories. The region was a trial ground for the implementation of Lugard's policy of so-called indirect rule, the practice of European colonial administration through retaining the members of the former ruling class of the Fulani. A small effort was made by the administration to create a working system in the first years, but Africans in the region rightfully rose up in what was known as the Saturu Uprising in 1906, an uprising that posed a very serious threat to British rule. This clearly indicated that the British had to plan their rule more carefully in northern Nigeria. Following this event, the relationship between the local elite and the officials started to improve, and a balance of power was somewhat achieved, at least from a British perspective. Successful taxation on imports resulted in a large surplus of revenues in the south, a major reason for the joining of the two southern regions in 1906, and later, with the return of Lugard in 1912, the north and the south as a whole. By this time, the colony of Nigeria had developed into the most important tropical colony of Great Britain in Africa. Out of the 1,399 Europeans serving in the colonial service in Africa, 622 were employed by the government of Nigeria in 1914, a figure that was to rise in later years. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.